Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Engage and Connect. Good to see some familiar faces there. Good to see some faces I don't know as well. Excellent. For those people who don't know me, my name is Rich Berry. I am co-chair of Engage, and I'm going to be taking us through a short session of about 40 minutes today, just looking at our own balance and mental health and well-being as heads, but also how we look after our staff in our institutions to make sure that we get through this incredibly difficult period in our working lives. So I'm going to take you into a PowerPoint, so just bear with me while I set that up. Okay. All right, everybody got my screen there? How is your window on the world? Everybody, yep, got nods, great, good. Okay, so window on the world is something that Mental Health First Aid England use, and I'll just take you through my work with them. So this is me. I'm now an education consultant, having been a teacher for 32 years, mostly in mainstream, I have to say, 23 years in mainstream, deputy head of 2 large mainstream secondary schools, and then a move into social emotional mental health in 2 separate schools where I was head for 9 years. I took early retirement in August 2019 to run my own company, and that was based upon the fact that I had found the work with the young people in SEMH school absolutely fascinating as to why all the strategies that I had from mainstream didn't work as far as managing behavior was concerned. And that led me into study around neuroscience and led me into a desire to spread the word around understanding emotional growth more. And so once I retired, I trained as a mental health first aid instructor, running 2-day youth courses. And I now run both adult and youth courses, both the 2-day, the half-day and the 1-day. At the same time, I've been a member of Engage for, I think, about 8 years now on the committee, Southwest Rep for Engage, and have been co-chair for 18 months with Sue, my wonderful co-chair who keeps me on task all the time. Okay, so that's me. I'm going to give you a health warning here that some of the things that I might discuss within this conversation may touch you or may remind you of other things, and therefore please feel free to take time out, switch your screen off, go for a little walk, come back to us. But please make sure that if you do that someone else knows what you're doing, as in your environment, in your establishment, to make sure you are okay. So here's a question for you. Mental health, what does it mean to you? So if I got you to think around that, when I pose this question on the courses that I run, most people associate it with illness. But we all have it, and there's no health without mental health. Historically, it's been massively stigmatized because of the link with illness. And attitude and stigma is often the thing that makes people feel worse. Okay, I'm not trying to teach my grandmothers to suck eggs here. Most of what we go through in this short presentation is very basic, but very often people lose sight of the most basic stuff. And therefore, it's really important that we understand what mental health is. So within mental health first aid, we look at mental health at being on a continuum. And that continuum moves up and down from maximal mental well-being and fitness to minimum mental health and well-being and fitness, and from no diagnosis to severe diagnosis. And most of us operate most of the time in the top right-hand quadrant. Okay, a person with no mental illness or disorder and positive mental health. Having said that, we move around within that quadrant because that's what mood swings are. Mental health, to be diagnosed with a mental health illness, you have to have been suffering for more than 2 weeks So if we think about anxiety or depression, no doctor will diagnose you unless you go to them saying, I've been feeling really low for quite some time. And they will say to you, how long? And you'll say, a couple of days. And they'll say, come back when see me in 2 days, in 2 weeks' time. If we look at the green lines and we look at the word within the green lines, stigma, which we've touched on already, it's really important that our own stigma around mental health is analysed, that we think about how we feel about mental health, because very often when we begin to feel low and we begin to suffer, very often it's the stigma that we attach to it ourselves that makes us struggle to recover. So here's a little exercise for you. I'm going to give you a minute now to write down or to think of as many derogatory words as you can to do with someone who is suffering with mental health issues used in common parlance on the street. Just have a little go at that for a minute. Okay, that's your minute. Okay, now I want you to do the opposite. I now want you to write down as many non-derogatory stigmatizing terms as you can, but they cannot be medical. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Okay, that's your minute. Now, when I do this on my courses, very often we find that on large pieces of flip chart paper that people are able to cover the flip chart with the first activity. If you think of words like crazy, wacko, nutter, you know, all those colloquial words that are used around somebody who really suffers. But actually we have very few words to describe people in a non-derogatory way. And that's where stigma comes in. And stigma causes anxiety in itself. And if we begin to suffer and we begin to feel poorly, very often it's made worse by our own anxieties around what people might say about us or think about us, because we are not in control. And therefore, many people try to hide their issues. So if we think about that, it's really important to know the signs of what to look for. And we'll cover that later as we go through. Okay, as I said, health warning. So, excuse my spelling here, which was the highest in the UK in 2018? Was it the number of deaths from road traffic accidents? Was it the number of deaths from substance misuse? Or was it the number of deaths from suicide? Road traffic accidents in 2018 in the UK, we lost 1,770 people. Do we see campaigns on the television? Do we see advertising around driving safely? Do we do road shows for our young people in schools around driving safely? Yes, we do. Substance misuse, 3,756. Again, lots of publicity around, you know, using substances. We do drugs education. We do all those bits and pieces. That figure is shocking. 16 people every day in the UK take their own life. Okay, and we do very little to talk about how to support those people. How many of you would know that actually raising the subject of suicide with somebody who is suffering actually helps them? Most of us would shy away from talking about it, but actually direct questioning around, are you thinking about taking your own life, is really, really important in helping young people to feel heard if they feel, or adults if they feel in that way inclined. Okay, it's the leading cause of death in men under the age of 50 in this country. So really important that we, especially with men, actually that we get underneath the skin and talk to people. Okay, so some more pre-pandemic statistics. 1 in 4 people experience mental health issues each year. At any given time, 1 in 6 working age adults have symptoms associated with mental ill health. Mental illness is the 2nd largest source of burden of disease in England. 72 million working days are lost at a cost of 34.9 billion each year. 70 to 75% of people with diagnosable illness get no treatment at all. So if we think about those stats being pre-pandemic, Mental Health Foundation UK have been doing studies on a monthly basis, and the latest study figures that came out in November are that 9 months into the COVID-19 restrictions and similar proportions of people are struggling with their mental health compared to those in late August, specifically as of late November. So almost half, 45% of the UK population had felt anxious or worried in the previous 2 weeks, which rose to 64% of respondents who have pre-existing mental health condition. Now, if we think about brain growth, and we think about neurodiversity, and we think about the growth of our limbic system, so many of the young people who we work with have underdeveloped emotional brains, underdeveloped limbic systems. Okay, if you are an adult who has been through issues as a child, you have less resilience to cope with things when they get difficult. So anxiety in adults, I'm sure every single person on this call has felt anxious at some point. But because we have good connectivity to the people around us, because we are good, emotionally stable adults, we are able to move on through that anxiety and put things in place to cope with it. But some people don't. And I know, looking back at my staff room, looking back at the staff who I employed, I knew who the ones who were resilient were, and I knew who were the ones who weren't. And therefore, keeping our eyes open for those people is really, really important. 1/4 of people reported feeling lonely in the previous 2 weeks. Feelings of loneliness were higher in younger people too, with 38% and 34% of people aged 18 to 24 or 25 to 34 respectively, which has been consistently higher across all waves than in the general population. It's because our young people are so sociable and they're missing out on that social activity. Seeing family freely, 25% of seeing friends freely, 16% were highlighted as ways that would help alleviate people's feelings of loneliness. And obviously in the national lockdown situations we're in now, that we really struggle with that. But here's a really interesting stat. Almost 1 in 5, wrong stat. Almost 1 in 5, 18% of the population reported feeling hopeless, and half, 49%, reported feeling frustrated in the last 2 weeks. Here's the helpful one. However, 61% of people reported that either being kind to others or receiving kindness from others was a positive impact on their mental health. We are aligned to connect with people. That's the way that we work. And therefore, in your leadership of your staff, making sure, I'm sure you're all doing this already, making sure that kindness exists all the time. Both kindness towards the young people, but both kindness towards the adults. And simple acts of kindness produce a lot of dopamine and serotonin in the brain. And they not only produce it for the people giving it, they also produce it for the people receiving it, but it's also produced for those people who witness it as well. So our mirror neurons cause kindness to support and help everybody. Okay. just to go on a little bit more, these facts around a lot of touch are really important. So as a leader, okay, I use contingent touch quite a lot, both with the young people, but also with the adults. Obviously, we have to be careful around that. You know, we need to know the people, but just a touch on the shoulder is really, really important. But, you know, I had staff who hugged each other on a regular basis in stressful situations because it's good stress relievers. So we know that skin-to-skin contact is vital, not only for mental and emotional health, but physical too. When you feel snowed under or pressurized, the body releases the stress hormone cortisol, one of the biggest things touch can do to reduce such stress, allowing the immune system to work the way that it should. Touch can also calm certain bodily functions such as your heart rate and blood pressure. So if we think about, you know, teaching ourselves to hug each other, what do we do when we get stressed? Very often we wrap ourselves up, we hug, we hold ourselves tightly. And actually that's about lowering our blood pressure, lowering our heart rate. And heart rate is crucial when we begin to look at anxiousness and anxiety, okay? And one of the things that we'll touch on in a second is sleep, and looking at sleep and how we control ourselves going into sleep to make sure that we're not anxious through the night. It talks about here, in early life, touch is thought to be crucial to building healthy relationships by stimulating pathways for oxytocin, the natural antidepressant serotonin, and the pleasure chemical dopamine. So that just goes back to that point where I said, where some of our adults who haven't had good life experiences, who do come to work in our environments because they want to make things better for young people, actually they might struggle to cope more in an environment where there's lack of touch, where there's lack of connectivity. Okay, let's moving on. So what can we do? As heads and leaders, the most important person is you. Relationships are key, and in the relationship you have with yourself is most vital. Okay, quote here from Robert Holden: the relationship with yourself sets the tone for every other relationship you have. So if you are not in a good place, it makes it really difficult to help other people to get into a good place. So self-care is more important than anything else. As a former head, I know there were times when I put the school ahead of everything else, ahead of my own health, ahead of everything else, because I couldn't afford for it to go down. I was passionate about it being in the right place. But actually, if you're not well enough to do that, you have to give time to yourself. So managing our stress. Short video here about what we now refer to as the stress container. Here it's referred to as the stress bucket.
Stress is usually seen as something we need to avoid. This is not true. We need stress, and we need our body's stress hormone cortisol to rise and fall throughout the day. Stress helps us wake up in the morning, helps us focus, learn, and remember new things. It's when people experience too much stress and start having difficulties coping that stress becomes a problem. High levels of stress can disrupt the natural changes in the body's stress response system and start to affect our physical and mental health. Over time, accumulated stress can result in false FFF response activations. When trying to measure our stress tolerance, the bucket analogy can be helpful. Our stress tolerance, or the size of our bucket, is a product of our genes, personality, and life experiences, and its size varies from person to person. The water in this analogy is the combination of all the stress in your life. We use the coping strategies we have available to keep our bucket from overflowing. They are like taps that allow water to drain from the bucket. Stress can include training, work, school, relationships, finances, moving, changing jobs, or the loss of a loved one. Both positive and negative experiences will affect the water level. A big bucket can hold more water or stress before it overflows. With a smaller bucket, less water is required for the water or stress level to become critical. While you can't change the size of your bucket, you can make life adjustments to reduce water coming in. You can also learn new coping strategies and stress management techniques to allow water to drain out. Mind tools, exercise, quality sleep, relaxation, and sharing your feelings with friends are some examples of effective water taps. Staying up late, sleeping in, drugs, inactivity, Procrastination, suppressing or ignoring problems are examples of unhelpful coping strategies or false taps. They might give temporary relief, but actually result in water flowing back into your bucket. This video was created by Brave, Building Healthy Minds.
So thinking about our stress containers, if we're dealing with young people, we know that their stress containers can sometimes feel very, very small. Okay, but what we need to be able to do with our staff is to be able to open up our stress containers with our taps on. So the activities that we do with them, the pressures which we place upon them, we have to think about the outcomes of what we're going through. And you know, I can't imagine what it's like to be head of a school at this moment in time, in these unprecedented times, where the stress is very often external, stuff the government are doing, stuff that your local authorities are doing that are putting pressure upon you. When you feel that pressure and things have got to be done, how does that get done? Well, it's by pushing those things down. So we have to be aware that the stress that we are feeling, we don't hold it for a start. We try and release it as much as possible. Okay, but we also need to think about when we are delegating how that moves forward to the staff who work for us. So I'm going to use a really simple analogy here. Okay. One that I use quite a lot, and that's about understanding the importance of the three-legged stool. So if we think about it as a stress anxiety model, the seat is good mental health. The three legs are good physical activity, good diet, and good sleep hygiene. Okay, and once one of those becomes shorter, the platform on in which the mental health sits becomes unstable. So if we think about, somebody who is self-isolating, maybe a member of staff who's not at work, are we checking on them to make sure they are okay? Because, you know, they can quite easily get involved in poor sleep hygiene where they're feeling anxious about what's going on, the fact that they're not at work, the threat of the virus, etc., etc. Their sleep hygiene goes out the window. What does that then impact on? Well, their desire to get out of bed and go and do physical exercise. Physical exercise is impacted on, that affects the diet. And all of a sudden, this simple model of a three-legged stool becomes unstable. I read an article in the Times a week or so ago. I'm just going to read you the first few lines of it, which you will recognize. It's by Matthew Paris. It says, "No reader will be unfamiliar with the visitor who, without warning, may perch on the side of our bed in the small hours. The stranger is faceless and nameless, but we all know him. I call him anxiety. Edward Lear called him the morbids. Churchill the black dog. You may have another name for the intruder, but all of us, even the least depressive, recognize a kind of terror that can all but overwhelm us in the sleepless hour before dawn. So many of you will be carrying stuff through the day that causes you to wake up at night and maybe sits on the side of the bed. So we need to think about strategies that enable us to get a good night's sleep, how we can encourage that. And using the three-legged stool model is really important. And we'll come on to why physical activity is important in a minute, but diet is also incredibly important. If we're just snacking and eating rubbish because we're constantly on the go, constantly trying to sort things out, that will impact on our sleep patterns. It will also impact on our desire to go out and do physical activity, which then impacts on sleep hygiene. So if we think about all those bits, it's about making sure that we do mindful activities before we go to bed. And here's a thought for you. I did a talk with a large group of people recently where I asked them how many of them keep their mobile phone by the bed. I then asked them how many of them look at their mobile phone when they get up in the night. I then asked them how many of them check their mobile phone before they say good morning to their partner. I can see a few people smirking. Okay, but actually, if that thing was taken away, if that wasn't there, would you be thinking about it? How about switching your phones off? How about leaving them downstairs? Big tough ask for many. We ask our teenagers to do it. We know that it's right for them, but actually, do we do that for ourselves? And do we talk to our staff about that? Do we say to our staff, no emailing between certain hours? because actually it's those things that constantly prey on your mind, that constantly keep you awake, that constantly cause the morbids or the stranger that called the black dog to come and sit by the bed. Having a wider perspective avoids accidents. So as ahead, I know that sometimes our focus can be very narrow, and through the pandemic, it must have been incredibly narrow, okay? But some things come along that preoccupy everything, we know that. I can only imagine that what dealing with the pandemic has been like, but my advice would always be to scrape the whole windscreen. Otherwise, things that come at you from left field can be overwhelming. And if we're using a window on the world that is very small and very narrow because we can't be bothered to address the other things, then those are the things that can very often unseat us and destabilize us. So going back to exercise, I never thought I'd be somebody as a roughy tufty PE teacher, rugby player, etc., who would be fascinated by what we call all. But actually, what I've learned through the whole period of time, through the pandemic, okay, is that actually all is incredibly important. So what's all? All is a positive emotion triggered by awareness of something vastly larger than self and not immediately understandable, such as nature, art, music, or being caught up in a collective act such as a ceremony or a concert. At the beginning of lockdown, the University of Trinity College Dublin and the University of California came to a joint study where they asked groups of people to go outside for 15 minutes a day and take a walk for 15 minutes a day. For 50% of the cohort, they asked them to look for all. They asked everybody on the study to take selfies. And at the end of the study, 6 months in, what they discovered was that the people who were looking for all were 60% more healthy in their heads, okay? And actually their selfies showed increased smiles and smaller versions of them with bigger pictures of the world. So they were in the bottom corner of the picture as opposed to dominating it. Because actually when we get out and about, it makes us feel so much better. So if we're exercising in the outdoors as well, and I know we've got some cold water swimmers here, actually it makes you come alive. It makes you embrace everything that's around you. And therefore, going back to the three-legged stool and thinking about the exercise that we do, it's no good going pounding the streets and just thinking about the problems that you've got all day. Actually, we need to open our eyes. We need to scrape the whole windscreen. We need to be looking in with more perspective. And I know that some colleagues on here have taken that to another example. We're actually having walking meetings where they're getting outside and talking to their staff away from the office to get people away from the harshness of what we're dealing with. A really good PDF here from the Mental Health Foundation that you can download to a guide to investing in your relationships. This was pertinent before COVID, but even more so. So if you're looking at supporting your staff, it talks about the relationship with yourself, but also understanding the importance of your interactions and your gratitude. Understanding that wherever you are in the UK, there's loads and loads of stuff going on around mental health at the moment. Some of it is very generic, but actually to look for support for your staff, you will know what you have access to through your local authority. But if you're a maintained school, but if not, what are you buying into that supports what counselling, what clinical supervision is available for your staff, okay? But also to look at what your local charities are doing. Okay, one of the things that I forgot to say is that I'm a mental health and wellbeing ambassador for the Rugby Football Union. And one of the things that I've been doing with the Rugby Union is looking within constituent bodies. So for Gloucestershire, say, looking at what the charities available to work with adults and young people are, because very often what we find is access to charitable services is much faster than it is through the NHS systems because they're so overwhelmed. And you know, it'll be interesting to see what the government do around funding for mental health once the pandemic is over. But at the moment, obviously, accessing charities is much easier. So think about what's available through your national charities, and there is some excellent stuff around our big charities. So Mind, Young Minds, Papyrus, the Mental Health Foundation, etc., are out there. And this document, this booklet, investing in your relationships is one I would recommend to you. Okay, moving on then. So reinforcing the need to open up everybody's window on the world. Okay, so if your window is open and you are thinking about what else is there, not just around the pandemic and what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, it will increase your connectiveness with your own education, your own values, your own spirituality, and the things that are out beyond that. And we all have different windows on the world. But again, as we go back to scraping that windscreen is really, really important. So looking at our colleagues and knowing what to look for, it can be really challenging to know what to look for, but when we are concerned and when to take action, here are some common signs of mental distress below as a good starting point for what to keep an eye out for. So someone feeling sad or hopeless, obviously, extreme mood swings, changes in eating or sleeping habits, isolating themselves from others, speaking about suicide or self-harm, increased use of drugs or alcohol, not taking care of their physical appearance or their hygiene. Those are all signs and symptoms. And finally, noticeably agitated or anxious. If you have a gut feeling that something isn't right, make time to have a conversation. Okay, very often the stigma that surrounds mental health is that actually I might say the wrong thing. I might say something that causes them to be worse. Well, actually, if you're having a non-judgmental conversation where all you're saying is, actually, I care about you and I want to try and help if I can, then have that conversation. Don't avoid it. So if you're really concerned or you think they are at risk of harming themselves or somebody else, then you need to seek help now from the emergency services. Other than that, just a simple conversation can help. So support for colleagues and ourselves as we emerge, and we will emerge. We need to think about how we support colleagues as the pandemic recedes, which it will. So demonstrating strong and courageous leadership is really important from my point of view. Showing care and consideration for everybody. Supervision will be vital. Okay, how we supervise. And I was lucky enough to work with a group of educational psychologists that trained my staff to do supervision groups where there didn't have to be a paid professional in the room, where they were actually able to supervise themselves, working in groups of 4 or 5, where actually they held conversations around different topics around the things that were going on for them within the school environment. And it was professionally resourced so that they were able to manage that and look after each other. Really, really important. So supervision, both individual and group. Social activities, what we do to keep people happy, how we get back together as groups when we're able to. And then implementing the lessons we've all learned into work and life. So many of the things that we've learned, some of the things we've done on previous Engaging Connects around the recovery curriculum, around the importance of being outside, around all those bits and pieces that we need to bring into our curriculums going forward so that we learn the life lessons from what we've been through. So my top tips for making a difference: the IT crowd is always the best. Almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. Okay. Reduce social media usage as adults, especially if that's one of the last things you do before you go to bed, because actually that's just getting your brain ticking over and you don't need to do it. Prepare yourself for bed by doing something that's mindful, whether that be reading some escapist stuff, going for a late night walk, okay, but getting yourself into that situation. Certainly not reading your emails and setting your day up for tomorrow. Do not allow 6 hours to go by without going outside and noticing something. How many of us have sat at these computers day in, day out, and actually, God, where's the time gone? Okay, it's time to eat. Okay, I'll watch something. Now I'm going to go to bed, without actually getting up and going outside. All right. Even if it's the bird feeders in the garden that you're looking at, get outside, do something that's good for you, and encourage your staff to do so. For me, mental health first aid is really, really important. So now more than ever, you and your staff need to train mental health first aiders. And in the current climate as it is, it's important, not more important than physical first aid, because physical first aid, we have to have it. It's a legal requirement. but actually if your staff room is destabilized by a few members of staff going off because we haven't noticed those signs early on, we haven't intervened, we haven't had that conversation, then actually that can destabilize your school. But putting staff out there who know what to look for, who've got their ears to the ground, actually really, really important for me. And if we can prevent one suicide through training our staff, then surely it's worthwhile. So let's all be mental health aware. A couple of things coming up. Tomorrow night, there's a really good program by Professor Byron, looking at improving your mental health, which touches on many of the things that we've talked about. That's on BBC One tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. It's part of a series. And something that came to my attention yesterday that I've had a really quick look at, and this is for your schools. It's by Pookie Knightsmith, and it's Become a More Mentally Healthy School or College. And that is a free resource up until the 24th of January. Okay, so obviously I think it's quite a long course. There are 11 modules to it, but if you can get in and have a look at it, I think it's, I had a brief look at it yesterday. It will help you as leaders within your schools to move forward. Okay, that's me. 35 minutes, got through that. Any questions that anybody wants to ask, feel free to free up your mics. There's not loads and loads of people on here, so we can free up our mics and come onto the screen if you've got any questions that I may be able to answer.
Excuse me, Rich, are you able to send the PowerPoint that you've done? I've been manically scribbling stuff down.
Yeah, it'll be on our website, Sheridan. So we've recorded this whole presentation and we'll post it up on the Engage website for you to access.
Thank you.
Anybody else? It's one of those questions.
Sorry, what was that last course? Oh, hiya. What was that course you just said? Sorry, I missed it.
Okay, Become a More Mentally Healthy School or College by Pookie Knightsmith. I will tweet it out on the Engage and link Engage to it. So if you look on Twitter, you'll find it there. If not, you can Google it. It's by Creative Education. I think it's on the Creative Education website.
Thank you.
Anything else from anybody else? Hope that's helpful. A few comments coming in saying really helpful. Like I said, none of this is rocket science, but very often the stigma that is attached to dealing with mental health, very often people feel that they can make it worse rather than better. So therefore, I think, understanding that no conversation is the wrong conversation, providing you're not using stigmatizing language, is really, really important. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of looking after yourselves. Would the school run without you? Yes, it probably would. Would it be a better place without you? Probably not. So look after yourselves. Okay, guys, I hope you've enjoyed that. I said we'll post it up on the Engage website. If you wish to share it with colleagues, please feel free to do so. Thanks very much.